Hello, everyone. Okay. Hello. My name is Kobe Rosen. I'm the co-editor-in-chief of the University of Chicago Philosophy Review, that's UCPR, along with Hayes Warden. On behalf of UCPR, I would like to welcome you all to our event featuring the Thinker and the Platypus Society, on the topic of the death of American democracy. As the Philosophy Review, we collect pieces from fellow undergraduate philosophers across the world to publish in our print journal and on our blog to disseminate their thoughts to the masses to inspire more philosophical inquiry. We are even offering our previous journals here tonight on the topic of simple questions, so you can pick that up after if you want. Our hope is that this event will embody the high-minded, life of the mind value our university often promulgates. Societal instability demands reflection and ideally a course correction. The philosophical sampling presented tonight highlights unique, but not the only, paths forward for the nature of American politics.
Before we begin, would you all like to introduce yourselves?
Also introducing Platypus, you mean?
Yeah.
Sure. Well, I'm Desmond. This is Clay, and last person is Ben. Part of Platypus. I'm the chapter head for the U Chicago chapter of the Platypus Affiliate Society. Should just do a brief introduction of what Platypus is. The Platypus Affiliated Society, established in December 2006, organizes reading groups, public fora, research, and journalism focused on problems and tasks inherited from the old 1920s to 30s, new 1960s to 70s, and post-political 1980s to 90s left for the possibilities of emancipatory politics today. So in terms of our activities on campus, we run a reading group which takes place every Sunday at Harper 151 from 12 to 2:30. And we also have informal discussion sessions called coffee breaks, which take place at Pret every Friday from 4 to 5 p.m. Of course, it's quite late in the quarter, so we're winding these things down. But actually, we do have a few events coming up. So this week on Wednesday, we have a panel on the Democratic Party and the left. You can find the poster over here, along with the Facebook event. And next week, we're also going to be hosting a teach-in from Professor Tony Mitchells from UW-Madison, who will be presenting on Jews and the socialist movement. So if you'd like to be involved in Platypus after this event, please reach out to me. And we also have our monthly publication in front here, the Platypus Review. And there's also a sign-up sheet if you want to sign up to our list host. So that should be all.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Ben. I'm a law student and an MBA student on campus. And I am also an editor for the Chicago Thinker, which is a right-wing student newspaper on campus. Our website is right there. We also are on Twitter, and we have a podcast, and we have a Substack. So it's a great chance to maybe get a little bit of a different perspective on campus than you might be hearing in class. And we include, so being right-wing, we have a spectrum of different right-wing opinions, including conservatism and libertarianism and other stuff as well that falls under that umbrella. I think you'll hear some variation tonight.
Yeah. Hi. I'm Perry. I'm a fourth-year undergrad, double majoring in economics and philosophy with a minor in history. I am a former, now senior editor of The Thinker.
My name is Declan Hurley. I'm the editor-in-chief emeritus of the Chicago Thinker. I retired a couple weeks ago.
Thank you. Let's begin. The 2024 presidential election weighs heavy on the world today. This unique moment in which a former president, routinely decried as an authoritarian who attempted to overthrow democracy, is running against an incumbent who was previously hailed as the next FDR but now suffers from the lowest fourth-year approval rating since Harry Truman, is inspiring fear and dread in both Democrat and Republican, left and right. This dread can be felt in the frenzy with which Democrats work to prosecute former President Trump, as well as in the dissident left's call to replicate the 1968 protest turned riot at the Democratic National Convention in order to oppose Genocide Joe. It can also be felt more subtly in the Republican Party's effort to reconcile with a man who made enemies out of the entire party, only to be carried by mass support to the top of this party once again, forcing Trump's detractors to withdraw their principled opposition to his demagogy. This bleak scene leaves few feeling optimistic about the state of American democracy. The United States was founded on the wager that liberal democracy might enable a greater freedom than could be otherwise achieved, and that the nation could wield this power wisely to secure life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness for all. But after 2.5 centuries of this experiment, few are feeling confident about the capacity of American democracy to secure the ends it set for itself. Neither the left nor the right can be consistently trusted to uphold liberal ideals. Both presidential candidates have accused the other of attempting to undermine a legitimate election, and both parties are attempting to register the economic discontent of the times through historical recourse. whether it be the rise in conservative support for the labor movement and figures like Josh Hawley and Compact Magazine's Sohrab Ahmari, the economic populism of both Trump and Biden, or the socialism of Bernie Sanders and the DSA. For debate mechanics tonight, each side will offer their perspectives to the questions that we give them for 8 minutes. Then each side will deliver a 4-minute response. We will knock at the 1 minute remaining mark for each presentation and knock again when their time has concluded. We'll have 3 rounds of this, and then we will open up a Q&A until the end of the event at 8 p.m. Our first question is addressed to Declan Hurley, the thinker, and Clay Mills of Platypus. What is the importance of American democracy? Is it now in crisis? What would it mean to overcome these challenges to democracy? Is the solution increasing or restricting democracy? We'll begin with the thinker.
Thank you very much, Hayes. So first I want to get some definitional questions out of the way. So I define a democracy as a political system in which popular majorities, rather than a monarch or a small group of elites, directly determine the course of public policy. Some characteristics of democracy: an unrestricted or nearly unrestricted franchise, meaning most people in a society can participate in elections. And the second characteristic, majorities choose their leaders in a representative democracy, or in a direct democracy, they directly decide on the course of public policy. So we see elements of both in the United States. We have a referendum system in many states. For example, Ohio opening up abortion laws by referendum, and we have the representative elements in our Constitution. So before I start my presentation this evening, I'd like to go back to 1787. And in 1787, you will know from your history classes, our Constitutional Convention delegates set out to Philadelphia to define a new government for the United States. And what we saw in the lead up to the Constitutional Convention are Democratic majorities in states issuing paper money, canceling debts, both public and private, and basically running roughshod over the rights of minorities. So it was too much democracy that brought the framers to the Constitutional Convention. So May 30th, 1787, there was a debate over how we should elect the House of Representatives. Should it be elected directly by the people or by the state legislatures? Elbridge Gerry, one of the 5 delegates from Massachusetts, and a future governor of Massachusetts and the U.S. Vice President, the 5th U.S. Vice President, said, and I'm going to read a long quote here because I think it's very good, "The evils we experience flow from the excess of democracy. The people do not want virtue, but are the dupes of pretended patriots. In Massachusetts, it has been fully confirmed by experience that the people are daily misled into the most baneful measures and opinions by the false reports circulated by designing men, in which no one on the spot can refute. One principal evil arises from the want of due provision for those employed in the administration of government. It would seem to be a maxim of democracy to starve the public servants." Gerry said he had been Republican heretofore. He was still, however, Republican, but he had been taught by experience the danger of the leveling spirit. Gerry had no objection, however, to an election by the people if it were so qualified that men of honor and character might not be unwilling to be joined in the appointments. Again, Elbridge Gerry, May 30th, 1787. He helps us identify, in my estimation, 3 problems with democracy. The first is that the masses will use their power over government to do bad things, such as canceling debt and advantaging debtors to the detriment of creditors. In a democracy, you often see people who are not successful in life get their vengeance against the people who have been. Second, majorities are not very good at electing good people or determining sound public policy. As Gerry says, they are dupes of pretended patriots. We can look no further, I think, than Lauren Boebert or Matt Gaetz or Marjorie Taylor Greene or Donald Trump to see this in action. Most people don't have the knowledge, wherewithal, time, or disinterestedness necessary to separate the political wheat from the chaff. The American electorate is woefully uninformed about the limitations of the Constitution. UChi's very own National Opinion Research Center found in 2023 that only 3% of Americans can name the 5 rights protected by the First Amendment. So we're dealing with an electorate that really doesn't know what it's talking about in picking people or deciding on policy. And third, the third problem, Jerry notes, men of honor and character won't run for office in a democracy. Only the demagogues remain. And basically this is because no one wants to debase himself before the voters. And that's what you have to do to get elected today. So, Jerry says the evils we experience flow from an excessive democracy, hence the Constitution. The Constitution attempted to moderate democracy by sequestering it in half of one branch of government, that is, the House of Representatives, and making the other 2.5 branches highly indirect. So I'll walk through some of the elements of the constitutional design. Presidential electors, who are selected in such a manner as the legislature of each state may direct, exercise their judgment in picking the president. Under the original Constitution, the Senate represents state governments, thereby checking majority whims emanating from the House. Third, courts constituted by an indirectly elected president and confirmed by an indirectly elected Senate further circumscribe majorities by subjecting their dictates to judicial review. And the Constitution, in the final analysis, created a constitutional republic. There's a salutary difference between majorities, their leaders, and public policy. However, America has incinerated this constitutional design. First, and this is probably, in my opinion, the least problematic, the franchise has become less restrictive. So if you look at 1780 in the Massachusetts Constitution, voters for the state senate had to own an estate worth at least 60 pounds. Today, there's no franchise restrictions, and that means that you have, poorly educated people in the franchise. Some of these people are dependent on legalized robbery for income. Second, the Senate is now popularly elected, so majorities control the direction of both chambers of Congress. Originally, the Senate was elected by the states. Third, majorities determine the president. So popularly chosen electors just cast ceremonial votes. It used to be that electors were actually allowed independent judgment. And the Supreme Court ruled back in 2019 that laws banning faithless electors are constitutional. So states can prevent electors from exercising independent judgment. Fourth, masses and not party bosses determine who is nominated for offices up and down the ballot. That was certainly not the case in 1789. Court appointments are increasingly politicized because of the democratization of presidential and senatorial elections. And since there's no real check on popular majorities because of all of the above. So what are the consequences? Well, I'm short on time apparently, so I'm going to point out one. We have a $34.7 trillion national debt. And that is because of majorities seizing wealth from the future to pay for the bills of the present. And Democratic primaries in particular have elevated demagogues and scared good people out of politics. You see this with, as I mentioned before, Matt Gaetz, Marjorie Taylor Greene, Elise Stefanik, Donald Trump. So what I propose is let's create a meaningful distance between majorities, office holders, and policy by returning to the Constitution. Let's repeal the 17th Amendment. Let's institute a balanced budget amendment. And let's restore the smoke-filled room. Party bosses did a better job picking people than Democratic primaries. This is a modest proposal, but one which I think will save this country.
I've been told to tell you that we all are members of Platypus, but we don't represent Platypus as an organization. We represent ourselves. The idea of America is not founded upon democracy per se. Rather, it's founded upon the consent of the governed, liberalism. The Constitution was established following the unsuccessful Articles of Confederation, which did not endow the federal government with enough power to properly execute the law. The tripartite federal government established by the Constitution was granted far-reaching powers, but a series of checks and balances between the three branches were also established to avoid general tyranny or any one branch dominating another. Bourgeois thinkers recognized that democracy per se could be dangerous, as it could come to be dominated by individual interests contrary to the public good by means of partisan politics, tyranny of the majority. Representative democracy is the means to achieve life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness for the governed. It was thought that for a government to represent the general will, mass democracy was not only unnecessary, but inimical to the maintenance of a proper state. For Rousseau and the Founding Fathers, the general will is not the sum of particular wills making up the nation, rather it is the social will, above and beyond the accumulation of particularity. Our society, bourgeois society, is the society of labor. Through all the particularity, labor is the universal factor which mediates all. Unlike the society of feudal order, a society of labor means that through one's free activity, the entire species can transform. The freedom of antiquity was merely the freedom to be what one is. We, however, invent ourselves anew as a species through our free activity. This is the promise of free labor. For us, this freedom is not merely the freedom of individuals, but the freedom of society. Society too is free to become something else. For the ancients, social change and progress was seen as a threat to one's God-given place in the world. Those with political freedom in America were the citizens who most thoroughly participated in society. Immediately after the establishment of the Constitution, white male landowners, as it was thought they would best represent the general will, as they also stood for the productive capacity of society at large. Their political liberty was founded upon their de facto social liberty. At the same time, the general intellect of society ensured that political freedom was not required to secure one's social freedom. For us who are bourgeois, the state is an expression of society and a necessary evil to secure the freedom of that society. It was not thought that the state should intervene in society to bestow political liberty where there was no social liberty. Rather, freedom was unfolding within society itself. Freedom was a process of becoming. It was only in the 19th century that it was clear that those who owned land stood for a class which was not identical with the general will, but rather represented a particular interest of its own. The development of industrial forces of production had outstripped the social relations that gave birth to them, making not work but the worker superfluous. Wage slavery was becoming a permanent condition for many, where in bourgeois society prior to capitalism, while wages existed, they are merely considered a step before establishing oneself as a self-sufficient member of society. New problems of freedom were created by overcoming the old ones. It was only through this change that it became necessary to expand suffrage. The political liberty of a few was no longer adequate to secure civil liberty for all. It was no longer clear that freedom would expand through society's own activity alone. Freedom proceeded in a self-contradictory fashion. The expansion of political liberty coincided with a diminishment of civil liberty. While more were being granted political rights, the latitude in which one could express one's freedom in society was shrinking. In the 19th century, this crisis was referred to as the social question, exemplified by mass unemployment, decline in living standards, and an increase in economic dependence. Today, mainstream discourse emphasizes a parallel between the pre-19th century republic and ancient democracy, as the dominant strain of political nihilism will paint the America of the 1789 Constitution as a slaveholders' democracy. However, despite the fact that modern democracy and ancient democracy are far cries from one another, it would be more educational to compare our modern mass democracy with the democracy of antiquity. The democracy of the ancient world required the participation of the entire citizenry, the demos. As while the ancient Greek city-states were democratic, they were not liberal. There was no protection of the minority against the majority. Indeed, being in the minority in ancient democracy was dangerous. One risked being ostracized, censored, exiled, or killed. Those who could not vote, women, slaves, and non-citizens, were totally excluded from the political system and were at the whims of what was enacted upon them by the democracy. In antiquity, one's life was only secured by a de facto compulsory participation in the political system. The institution of mass democracy in modernity has had interesting parallels with this, as the institution of women's and black suffrage in America was done under the understanding that the civil liberty of both cannot be secured without the state institution of their political liberty. This aspect of our democracy is now weaponized by the political system, particularly the Democratic Party, to mobilize voters. If the Republicans are elected, black, gay, trans, etc. rights will be violated. Democracy will be in danger. It's through this means that the political status quo is maintained, the Democratic consensus holding their constituency hostage through political blackmail. Meanwhile, the figure who disrupted the status quo, Trump, is ostracized by the entire political establishment, which is enacting lawfare measures against him in order to erect barriers to his re-election.
The entire state is conspiring against a single person, conjuring up novel legal theories and cases against him in order to secure the Democrats' control of the state. Despite this, what the Democrats are doing, lawfare, electioneering, etc., are all aspects of democracy, in the way political imprisonment, assassination of one's political opponents, and political party paramilitaries are. In ancient Rome, these phenomena accompanied every election, blood flowing in the streets. Both the Democrats and Trump accuse each other of violating democracy, and perhaps both and neither are wrong. Democracy is the fulcrum of the political crisis. This problem extends all the way back to the 19th century. It's an expression of the transitory character of our historical epoch, capitalism. The crisis of society requires the state to stand over and above it to mediate this crisis, violating democracy and liberalism in order to sustain them. Marx referred to this phenomenon as Bonapartism, but Bonapartism expressed a need that Marx recognized as the proletariats to fill. Marx and Engels wrote in the Communist Manifesto in 1848 that the first step in the revolution by the working class is to raise the proletariat to a position of the ruling class to win the battle of democracy. The proletariat will use its political supremacy to wrest by degrees all capital from the bourgeoisie, to centralize all instruments of production in the hands of the state. By this is meant of the proletariat organized as the ruling class. The experience of the failed 1848 revolutions, however, led them both to disavow this. The working class would need to organize independently of bourgeois politics, stating the necessity of a dictatorship of the proletariat, a transitory stage where the proletariat would organize themselves as a state in order to take responsibility for capitalism and thus overcome it through their own activity. Only under the DOP, thought Marx, could the social question, the problem of social unfreedom, be taken up politically. Later, the experience of the Paris Commune in 1870 and 71 would lead them to say that the Commune was an image of the dictatorship of the proletariat. In the Paris Commune, legislative and executive functions were combined into a single body. For Marx and Engels, it was more democratic than bourgeois democracy, which was not good in itself, but a means to develop the political power of the proletariat. Indeed, what is consistent between the need to win the battle of democracy and the necessity of a dictatorship of the proletariat is the proletariat taking responsibility for society, allowing it to recognize itself as the body regenerating capitalism, and thus posing for the necessity to abolish itself. For us, democracy is a necessity, not a good. If American democracy is in crisis today, its crisis is greatly diminished from the peaks of revolutionary history. Indeed, these crises pose the possibility to change the world, though at great risk. Our moment lacks that sort of vitality. Biden's election was posed as a back to normal, and now Trump 2024 runs on that same basis, back to normal. No matter who wins, people will feel less political agency now than even recent history at the 2010s. Most will not participate. I'm nearly done. Not because they feel that their liberty will be secure, whether or not they participate, but because they've grown apathetic to the political system. Only by working through the crisis of democracy would we be able to reach a moment where we could rescue that greatest right of all, the right to not participate, unknown to the ancient world. Perhaps it would be fair to say that a death of liberalism is a far greater crisis than the death of democracy. What the Democrats do in their current lawfare measures against Trump violates basic liberal sensibilities, the rights of the minority against the majority. Mobilizing the entire apparatus of the state against a single man, former president or not, would make the framers of the Constitution shudder. And if they can do it to a president, they can do it to anyone.
We'll now hear a 4-minute response from the thinker. Please try to keep to time so that everything can run smoothly. You need an extra minute in there.
I think I could come up with some things to say for 4 minutes.
Okay, so whenever you're ready.
I realized in my presentation I did not really examine my theoretical priors. So I want a government that protects individual liberty, at least at the national level, and governs well. So that's why I have a strong emphasis on ensuring the good people rise to the top of government. And you achieve that by at least having some sort of filtering process between the majorities and the elected. And you see that process in the original Senate, which was elected by state legislatures. So you would have people vote for their state representatives, then no state representatives would elect the senator to represent the entire state. So that filtering process produces more competent governments than you would have if you just had the masses vote directly. And these types of institutional restraints also give us a time to breathe a period to breathe before instituting rash policy. So the Senate, as originally constructed, required the Democratic majority in the House to get the consent of a separate constituency, the states, before passing reckless policy. Today we have no such filtering system. One constituency, the masses, majorities, elect both chambers of Congress. So there's really no filtering mechanism anymore. And the courts are increasingly politicized. We see that with Josh Hawley saying he wouldn't vote for a judicial nominee if they didn't commit to banning abortion or whatever he said. That's the type of thing we see today. Democracy has taken over every area of American government. So I hinted at one of the consequences, a $34.7 trillion national debt. And that's essentially confiscation of money from the future, resources from the future. But we also see majorities in real time expropriating and redistributing money possessed by wealthy minorities. For example, in Cook County, this is from the Illinois Policy Institute, in Cook County, the potential sum of welfare benefits can reach $48,000 annually for single-parent households and $41,000 for two-parent households. This is expropriation by Democratic majorities who have no checks on their action. And what you also see in democracy is a constant aversion to difficult choices. Social Security has been running deficits since 2010. This trust fund will be depleted in 2034. There's no coming back from that. The national debt is exploding. This is because nobody in a democratic system will forfeit his own welfare payments. That is a chronic, perpetual, and irreversible flaw of democracy as we've currently constituted it. So as I said before, my proposition is to restore the concept of democracy we had in 1789. Minus, I should specify very clearly, we should have absolutely no restrictions along racial or gender-based lines on who can vote, obviously. But we do need to have some sort of check on raw Democratic majorities and their ability to make reckless decisions that imperil people today and in the future. Thank you.
I think it's worth noting, I'm sure a lot of people in the audience also noticed that the way we both established our arguments started in a very similar way. Both of us will like to uphold the original framers of the Constitution, but then what happens is where we end up with that veers off in different directions. You seem to have a kind of originalist reading of the Constitution where there were certain virtues in the Constitution that have been violated throughout the passage of time. And one thing I'd be interested to know is where does that big break happen for you? Because I noticed you use the language of smoke-filled rooms, and I'm like, oh, the Gilded Age. And it kind of makes me think of maybe the problem was progressivism that happened with Woodrow Wilson, Roosevelt, that happens in the early 20th century. What else did I write down?
Would you like me to answer the question?
Sure, actually.
Yeah. So I would say probably around 1913. So in 1911, you saw the House of Lords in Great Britain lose its power to hold up bills indefinitely. It got cut down to 2 years. So around 1911 in Great Britain, 1913 in the United States when we killed the original concept of the Senate. It's basically where the fork in the road emerged.
I don't have much else to say other than I did, of the original stuff, I did disagree with the bit about men of honor and character because I feel like that doesn't appreciate the heroism of the kind of political characters that appear today, who appear repulsive but actually do have a sort of modern heroism that maybe someone like, I can't say his name right now, Eldridge Cherry wouldn't be able to quite appreciate, because we live in a different kind of historical epoch where heroism takes on a different sort of character.
Do you want me to respond?
I don't have anything much else to say, so we can keep it as a dialogue.
I actually flagged a few senators who I like, but none of them are in office anymore because they were either forced to stand down from office, not run again, or just left because they knew they wouldn't get reelected again. So I would cite Jeff Flake, Ben Sass, Rob Portman, Pat Toomey. These are all good, decent people who made difficult choices on the Senate floor, opposed Trump, all four of them. and you'll never see them in politics again, is my guess. They've been replaced by absolute, in two of these people's cases, by absolute lunatics who should not be in public office. J.D. Vance is one of them. So what we have essentially are good people sometimes getting into office, but not staying for long. That would be my analysis of that situation.
We got there. Thank you. In general, for these 4-minute responses from each side, if you want to make it more fluid too, and like ask questions to each other, you just set basically like, we'll have 2 4-minute timers, and once that time's expired, then we'll move on to the next question. So yeah, I think we'd really appreciate, like, from an audience perspective, like engaging with both sides to really tease out the differences. So that was very.
Like instead of 4 response, just do like an 8-minute, like we ask each other like cross-examination questions or something like that. That'd be better.
Yeah, that fine with you guys?
You guys want that more?
Yeah, that sounds great.
All right, cool.
Okay, so our second question goes to Ben, the Platypus, and Harry Zhao, the thinker. Civil liberty is foundational to American democracy. The enshrinement of the most fundamental civil liberties in the very first acts of the Constitution affirms this fact. If the left and right routinely demand limitations on civil liberty for the sake of other political commitments, why is civil liberty so frequently surrendered for other considerations, despite the necessity of robust civil liberties in a liberal democracy? What are the historical origins of the present antagonism between civil liberty and democracy, and how might this antagonism be overcome? All right, so we'll start with the Platypus this time, and you'll have 8 minutes.
Okay. Okay. The American Revolution was a revolution for society. In our first dialogue with the thinker, we explored the historical origins of the idea of society in what is generally called the early modern period. Its first intimations, this is probably familiar with people, the Renaissance through the Reformation, Age of Discovery, commercial, scientific revolutions, culminating in the Enlightenment and the revolutions in 1776 and 1789. The American Revolution sought to establish a polity that would preserve civil society as the fundamental site of human freedom in its fully open-ended, historically unfolding character. Civil liberties, therefore, were crucial to prevent the state from infringing and stamping out civil society. In a bourgeois republic, constitutional civil liberties have the added salience of presenting a tyranny of the majority, deploying the state against society. The formation of the Constitution in the late 18th century consolidated, extended, and deepened the American Revolution and its specifically radical character in this respect. This was once a truth universally acknowledged, this relation of the Constitution to the American Revolution, but beginning with the progressive movement in the 1910s and 20s, a number of pseudo-divisions and historiographical debates emerged in order to justify the emergence of a new authoritarian state capitalism, which took the form of progressivism in the United States. As progressivism, unlike its triplets, Stalinism and fascism, have been totally naturalized in contemporary mainstream American politics today, the historical understanding of the Constitution, constitutional civil liberties included, has atrophied, along with the diminished horizon of politics that is attendant to the naturalization of progressivism. I'll limit my discussion of such historical memory decline because this was covered more extensively the first time we did this thing with the thinker. But one brief but illustrative example would be the debate over the Bill of Rights in the 1780s. The minority of the Federalists who briefly opposed the Bill of Rights did so not because they wanted a more expanded government, as is commonly believed, like some sort of Hamiltonian statism, but rather because they thought that the Bill of Rights would be interpreted as an exclusive, non-inclusive list of rights that the government could not violate, thus encouraging infringements of civil society that aren't delimited in the Bill of Rights. I just raise this to emphasize the consensus on the ends or the meaning of the constitutional protection of civil liberties across the American Revolution. So Marx identified capitalism as the self-contradiction of this bourgeois society, represented prominently by the ideals and social conditions of the American Revolution and the French Revolution, etc., understood globally. So it's the contradiction of that under the new 19th century Industrial Revolution. The basis of the pre-industrial bourgeois world was the freedom of small artisanal labor and cooperation, and the general deployment and individual ownership of private property across society. Labor was the means to life and freedom once work is stripped from the traditional ancient ordo of the pre-modern caste system, which Clay described very well. The Industrial Revolution throws bourgeois society into permanent crisis, with one of its most important symptoms being the abolition of private property and the excretion of a new class of workers who exchange the value of their labor for a wage, instead of owning their own private property as their means of production. For our purposes here, I'll emphasize the political implications. Marx was witness to the total transformation of society and politics as the Industrial Revolution spread and deepened its hold on bourgeois Western Europe in the 1840s. The culmination of this was the 1848 revolutions and the counter-revolution, which advanced in a peculiar and novel form in France under Louis Napoleon Bonaparte. I'll condense a lot of this counter-revolution here, but Napoleon III instituted things like the first welfare state-funded employment schemes for general employment, a central bank. He created the modern police. He restricted free speech and civil liberties, but he did so in the name of protecting the workers and advancing his form of socialism. Prominently, Marx isolated how contradictory this new phenomenon of Bonaparte gunning down the workers in the name of socialism, including the self-contradiction within conservatism as well. He writes, bourgeois fanatics for order are shot down on their balconies by mobs of drunken sailors, their domestic sanctuaries profaned, their houses bombarded for amusement, in the name of property, of the family, of religion, and of order. Marx treated Napoleon III's reign as a prophecy for the future, the global future of politics and the state in capitalism. Hence, he characterized capitalist politics in total epochal terms as Bonapartism. Importantly, however, Marx treated Bonapartism as the responsibility of the proletariat, whose class struggle for employment and the demand for the full value of their labor both destabilized and raised the stakes of capitalist politics, necessitating such measures as the modern welfare state, police, etc. The contradiction of bourgeois society and the industrial forces of production manifests politically as a contradiction between democracy and liberalism. The Bonapartist state will trample on liberal civil rights to meet the democratic discontents of the workers and the oppressed and crack down on the general destabilization that the class struggle produces. In Marx's own time, the working class began to self-organize around the demand to receive the value of their labor, which is to say to organize on the basis of the bourgeois ideal of receiving the value of their own labor, by creating unions, consumer cooperatives, mutual aid funds. Socialists and intellectuals, even before Marx, debated the relative value of participation in the state. Now you'll notice the examples I gave of unions, consumer cooperatives, and mutual aid funds are civil society organizing that have nothing to do with state policy. So the issue within the socialist movement became to what extent should the workers seek redress, support, and therefore integration in the capitalist state. Historical Marxists aimed at politicizing the permanent crisis by organizing working class discontents totally independently of the capitalist state, only at the level of civil society. The Marxist parties from 1848 through the Second International, which was founded in 1889 and persisted through the World Revolutionary Crisis of 1917 to 1919, participated in elections for the capitalist state primarily to gauge relative support and do agitation and propaganda, but importantly not to join coalitions with the ruling classes, the ruling class governments. However, Marxist parties did not categorically rule out being voted into power, potentially, especially in democracies like the UK, France, and the US. The class struggle led by the socialist parties intended to advance the power of the organized working class to lead to the dictatorship of the proletariat, which Clay introduced. The dictatorship of the proletariat was intended to work through this contradiction of bourgeois right by the workers themselves, creating the necessary precondition to resolve the self-contradictions of liberal democracy, whose contradiction is rooted in this undermining of the value of labor. Both liberalism and democracy point beyond themselves, historically, but Marxists have tried to avoid projecting or prefiguring what lies beyond liberalism, democracy, or bourgeois right, because any projection of a free humanity from the standpoint of the capitalist present would be a deformed projection from an unfree condition today. And that goes back to Marx's earliest writings and through the later writings as well. That this is constantly the socialist movement was an object of critique for projecting a utopian future as an image of the present discontents, which was self-contradictory. Because of the emphasis on the civil social power of the working classes, civil liberties became crucial to support to give as wide a breadth to civil society as possible, because that is where the workers would build immediate power. Such issues within the socialist movement became important. I'll give 2 examples here. One is the Dreyfus Affair in France, in which the military was threatening to take power, restrict civil liberties, and was conducting violence against the Jewish minority. Lenin, Luxemburg, Karl Kautsky, Jean Jaurès, who were important leaders in the Second International at the time, polemicized for the French Marxist parties to support the Dreyfus Affair campaign to defend these rights, even though they weren't immediately related to, say, wages or whatever, or workers specifically. The second example I can give is Eugene Debs in America. his free speech was cracked down upon due to the opposition to entry into World War I, and there was a powerful state-backed, move to, and he was imprisoned. I'll try to wrap this up. Anyway, the Socialist Party of America steadfastly campaigned for the right to free speech, and that was important for their own organizing activity. The Second International successfully advanced the class struggle to produce a global revolutionary crisis in 1917 and 1919. However, the world revolution failed outside of a limited victory in Russia. In the aftermath of this failure, a compounded history of defeats have decimated the left's horizon of politics, including the total statification of the workers' democratic discontents, the attempt to see the workers be supported by the authoritarian capitalist state, things like the NLRB, etc. Anyway, this has set the stage for the present left's attitude towards free speech, a diminished importance for free speech because the workers' democratic discontents can be met, and there's a diminished interest in protecting civil liberties. And I think that this is related to everything that people are familiar with today, like whatever buzzwords you want to use, like woke, cancel culture, whatever, SJW stuff. And also, as Clay mentioned, the uncritical attitude towards the abusive lawfare that's being leveraged against Trump based on novel interpretations of the law. All right, real quick, almost done. The left today is dead because it All right. The left is dead today because it naturalizes the dismissal of civil liberties as essentially important demand for socialist politics. If the left is to transform the world, it must first transform itself. That means a reinvestigation of its history, which we in Platypus attempt to provoke.
Okay, no problem. Okay. So first, I think it's just really important to distinguish civil liberties and civil rights. As far as I'm aware, civil liberties are defined as protecting individuals from unjust government coercion, and civil rights protect individuals from unequal treatment based on factors like race, sex, etc. And nowadays, that's obviously not necessarily just protection from the government or the public realm, if read expansively. So, as I take the question that I've been asked, there's sort of three sub-questions to that. So first is why civil liberty so frequently surrendered for other considerations. I would say that it's because government turns out nowadays to be a really convenient and politically expedient tool. It's a tool used to pass ideological and partisan agendas. It's prevalent on both sides of the aisle, I'd say. And I think clearly the elected officials see it this way. An example of this is just why both sides of the aisle, when their chamber is in power, endeavor so vigorously to abolish the filibuster, because it turns out the filibuster gets in the way of advancing their ideological agendas. Another reason it's surrendered is because of the blurred lines between public and private realms. And an example I'd use of this actually is from the right, and it's basically part of Ron DeSantis' Stop Woke Act. Essentially, as I understand it, attempts to restrict discriminatory practices by private businesses. Now, I'm opposed to this, not on the grounds that I like woke practices or whatever buzzword you want to insert there, DEI, etc. But instead, I think it's because state government should not ban private businesses from enacting woke policies or DEI. Instead, I think they should be held accountable by shareholders, investors, other people who are pretty disgusted by those policies, or maybe not disgusted. I mean, the shareholders do whatever they want. Another reason I think civil liberties are so frequently violated are because of blurred lines between the state and federal realms as well. And particular to this is the idea of the Supremacy Clause in the 10th Amendment. I think that establishes a pretty clear distinction as to what is within the realm of your state government to act and what is within the realm of your federal government. And on that, I'm actually opposed to, for example, federal legislation on abortion policies. I'm not trying to state what my position is on abortion. I think rather I'd just say that the Dobbs ruling gets to the heart of the issue of abortion in the sense that it returned the problem to the states as opposed to the federal government. It essentially said the Constitution itself grants no right to abortion, and basically that's up to your state government to decide whether you want abortion or not. Lastly, I think civil liberties are violated just because of different ideals, at least in the U.S. on both sides. As I generally understand it, the left kind of sees the government as expedient in advancing economic agendas, for example. So they're willing to, I would say, curtail civil liberties in the economic sense. The right certainly is more willing to intervene on social grounds. So just to give you an example of these two, the Marxist agenda, as I understand it, of using government is to essentially try to abolish profit, fix prices, redistribute goods, as we're saying in the welfare state, control the means of production, et cetera, et cetera. We see these kinds of things happening to some degree in the Nordic states as well as the Israeli kibbutzim, although it's a little bit less prevalent now in the Nordic states. On the other hand, the social conservative has the agenda of trying to establish a state church, kind of the culture wars, also tightening laws on transgender issues, and these are kind of the things where the right tends to lose libertarians on. I'll go to the second sort of sub-question now, which is what are the historical origins of the present antagonism between civil liberty and democracy? And here I think I agree certainly more with Declan, where I think it's first important to just put out there that democracy is a super vague term. It's also a buzzword. And as I understand it, democracy exists in degrees as opposed to a binary. You don't just have a democracy, you don't have it. I mean, there are many sort of democratic or liberal systems of government. You can have that or not have those, some elements, some you don't. I mean, I'll give you some examples. It's like you have to ask which governmental offices are elected, which are appointed, how wide is the electorate? In the United States nowadays, that's very wide. And historically, even in the Massachusetts Bay Colony, it was really wide. But in southern colonies, it was more restrictive to property holders of certain shillings. I think these excesses of democracy create some problems with perverse incentives. And the reason I say this is just because, for example, government officials nowadays are tied to being paid a pretty nice, I would say, at least livable salary. I think that encourages things like populism as well as making electability the prime consideration when running for office. And this becomes especially perverse when pairing it with a wide, if you want to use the word vulgar, electorate. It essentially encourages candidates to kowtow to unknowledgeable masses. Just to kind of give a more personal example, it's like how many people really actually know what they're voting for on their entire ballot? When you really get down there, you hardly know half of those people and their names and what the hell they're doing. Actually, funny enough, I have some poll statistics as well, similar to Declan's, where according to Pew in 2023, only 57% of people knew one of the 5 rights guaranteed by the First Amendment. I think it was less than 1% knew all 5. So 57%, just over half, only knew one of them. Freedom of speech, by the way, is one of them. So be glad you're here. 68% knew what determines the number of House representatives states get, which I think is pretty remarkable. And all this being said, all of the above explains why lobbying, for example, is a super powerful tool. Because it turns out politicians care about electability. They're easily bought and sold. I think that's the one thing that Vivek Ramaswamy certainly got right in his debate. Now, on the origins of this, I think this is because we really went pedal to the metal on this idea of democracy, but to a really perverse extent. I think this ties fundamentally into our abandonment of the classical understanding of politics, I think especially ones by like Plato. I think that's had a huge influence historically on Anglo-America, where you basically have to balance elements of monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy. Historically, the excesses of the first two were far more common. The English saw this at least, with the tyranny of Charles I, the Stuart line, all that drama. They also saw it in Caesar. The founding fathers cited it frequently in their discussions. On oligarchy, you saw they certainly saw the 1772 partition of the Polish-Lithuanian kingdom and thought that was the main source of that problem. A few modern examples, I would say, or more modern examples, are the 17th Amendment made by, essentially which made both chambers of Congress elected. Before, senators were elected by state legislatures. And my home state example of Illinois was that now we have an elected judiciary. And because of that, the Democrats were able to gerrymander our judicial districts and essentially stuff the court with partisans. And it turns out, it's pretty, again, expedient to do so. An example I think Declan's more familiar with would be the British Reform Acts of the 19th century, which is basically kind of essentially the Labour Party's plan to water down the House of Lords eventually. Now, the last point is just how might this antagonism be overcome? And I think there are a few steps we should do. First, we need to stop the cult of worship around democracy and the idea of mass voting. The IOP certainly doesn't help this, in my opinion. I think clearly a perverse outcome of this is having people with no vested interest in the local community casting votes, which speaks a little bit to the irony of people claiming gentrification. We should also approach young career politicians with suspicion. I think it's in their interest to only care about electability as well as making large sums of money through lobbying, and who can blame them? The system makes it rational to do so. With this all, I think it's just important to consult history. I mean, things happen for a reason. Federalist 10, I think, is just great reading in general to understand the Founding Fathers' vision of the excesses and dangers of democracy. And I'll just close with a final quote from Edmund Burke's Reflections on a Revolution in France. They despise experience as the wisdom of unlettered men, and as for the rest, they have wrought underground a mind that will blow up at one grand explosion all examples of antiquity, all precedents, charters, and acts of parliament. That was to the democratic revolution in France. Thank you.
We're going to take audience questions. Do we want to do that?
We have the time for that after.
Okay.
Everyone goes to
All right.
Fine. Okay. We'll go into the, let's say 6 minute back and forth for, I
Whatever
encourage
works.
you guys to go through, what, where do you most disagree? What point did you take issue with the most? Would be, probably helpful to tease out, where you guys all stand and, the differences. Okay, so you want to start?
Yeah, I'll just start with a specific question that I had, which is that you said that the origins of this is that we've abandoned the classical understandings of politics. And you threw in Plato, which was odd because the Founding Fathers weren't into Plato. Like John Adams was like, this is irrelevant, but I'll leave that aside. But so the classical history or understanding of politics, and you cited that they had historical memory of they would cite in the Federalist Papers they would cite the Netherlands as too much legislature or whatever. But then why? So my point is where did that historical knowledge go? Who lost it and why? Why did that happen?
Yeah. Well, I think it's just a complex issue because, first of all, you had a wide variety of founding fathers, all with different understandings of what the American, experiment was going to be. And I would just say, at least as I understand it, it's kind of an issue where over time it sort of erodes because, for example, with policies like enfranchisement, it's always easy to grant enfranchisement to large swaths of people, and it's a lot harder to roll that.
Why is it, when you say always, how? Why is it always easy to grant enfranchisement to large groups of people?
Well, just because, for example, you have offices of government that are democratically elected, so, I would say, for example...
But the mass democracy in America took place in the 1820s and 1830s, when there was a much more minimal state than, at later points when the franchise was expanded.
Yeah, but I think that's sort of where it started, though. Just because, first of all, there was an issue just of things like requirements that essentially kind of eroded over time. For example, as far as I'm aware, I'll just give you an English example where the shilling requirement was ultimately kind of essentially not effective just because it was pegged at a certain rate, and it turns out with inflation you have a lot more people, and I think that effect is a lot more pronounced where you have in the 19th century the Reform Acts that essentially just enfranchise people like non-property holders, other groups.
And it happens at the same time in a lot of different countries. In the 1820s and 1830s, as the Industrial Revolution's unfolding, you have the onset of mass democracy in America, in England, and in France there was a liberal revolution in 1830. So I just mean it's just a thought error that people just started forgetting the classical lessons. Why did it happen when it did? Why did mass democracy happen when it did?
Can I offer a thought on this? So the Marquis of Salisbury, who was an English statesman, believed that America was essentially America's example in 1776 was responsible for the world's democratization, because we provided the light and the way for all these countries as they pursued democracy. So I think that's more like the nucleus for that conception, even if it was formed based on other countries' examples and thoughts. And as far as the question of where all this knowledge went, I think it's not so much of a question of people getting stupider, but voting rights being extended to more and more people, and voting being expected of more and more people. So I don't think that the percentage of the population that's lettered has changed all that much over time.
I think,
Consistent with what you said, Perry, though, because you said very specifically that the origins of this is the abandonment of the classical understanding of politics. So again, my question is just, in your view, where did that go? Why did that happen?
Well, I think a distinction we need to make clear is just that it's not like there's a sort of fixed level of democracy, aristocracy, and monarchy that's commanded of us. I think that's ultimately, that idea is a dynamic one in the sense that the balance that's required, say, today is going to be different just because you have a lot more people, everyday people with educational degrees, et cetera, et cetera. And I think the United States, for example, is not going to be the same as England just because, fundamentally, we never had titles of nobility. We don't have a monarchy, so that's inherently going to throw a wrench into things. And I think also just with the perversion of mass media, with newspapers, and
but
just
again,
the
that's
general...
like 100 years after what we're talking about. So it's not about mass media, unless you mean newspapers. But I think a lot of countries had newspapers. England had newspapers for like 100 years, and there was no before Chartism. Before the attempt to expand the reform bills you're talking about.
Only 20% of adult men voted in 1832, and it wasn't until 1867 that you enfranchised the urban working classes, and it wasn't until 1884 you enfranchised the rural working classes. This was a very slow development.
Yeah, I know. My point is just I think we should, if we want to answer this question that was asked to us by the wonderful, folks here, we should think very carefully about when this happened, when it did. That might give us an insight into this. And I don't think I'm satisfied totally with this. Well, of course I'm not, because we're debating, I guess. But
What's your answer?
I would say, from Marx's point of view and the historical Marxist point of view, that there's something big happens in the 19th century, a mass social revolution and a social contradiction of bourgeois society, which necessitates mass democracy.
It's not simply that mass democracy is merely bad. It's something that actually has to be worked through because it's being posed by the social system itself. It's it's constituent of the crisis.
If I could put what your talk was more in a single sentence, is why is there mass democracy after the Industrial Revolution, whereas there is not mass democracy in the age of bourgeois society or a pre-industrial bourgeois society where people are small artisans that own their own means of production? It's because democracy is necessitated by the possibility of unemployment that comes with capitalism. Once you have capitalism, once you have a proletariat that's dependent on a job where they could get fired from, independently of what their boss wants, like an economic crisis can just force their boss, against the boss's better judgment, to fire you, that's when you need democracy. That would be the Marxist point. Because you need the state to intervene to help you out because you have the discontent of trying to get a job. Whereas again, so to take the French Revolution in 1789, there was a carve-out for the right to vote, and that was for domestic workers. And so the question is was that an accident? Did they just forget domestic workers? No, the rationality of that was that the domestic workers are wage workers, but they're not in a sort of generalized permanent economic crisis in the Industrial Revolution. So the wage workers share the exact same public interest as their employer. In capitalism, after the Industrial Revolution, once you're employed, your interests with your employer diverge because your employer does not guarantee your job because an economic crisis can remove you from being employed, independently of what the employer wants. That's the idea. That would be what we would say.
Well, okay, yeah. I think there are a few points that you're making in there, so I think I'm just going to attempt to answer them sort of one by one. So first, I think maybe a point of disagreement we have is just this idea that perhaps my view is that it's not so much as that we've suddenly abandoned this idea of classical politics, more so that you have gradual forces over time. So I think you're talking about one crucial point being the Industrial Revolution. I would suggest, though, that even starting in the 18th century in Britain, before America separated, that you had the rise of a popular politics movement by the radical Whigs, people like John Wilkes. And I think those pressures were already there. It just happened that, if the Marxist thesis is correct, what you're saying is essentially that the Industrial Revolution is sort of what maybe, unlocked all of these attributes that we're already developing. On the point of the sort of labor-capitalist relation, I think one point I would question, though, is just, isn't there a sense of mutual independence in theory between capital and labor, in the sense that you have capital that's essentially stuck in place without labor, but labor that's also amplified by the use of capital, in the sense that there is this mutual dependence. So in that sense, you sort of have the idea that on the macro scale, the interests are going to be tied together because your productive powers require the synthesis of both.
We'll take like a 30-second response.
Yeah, briefly. On a macro level, yes, but on at the individual, you could say firm level, no, because it's not up to the boss to determine if you're employed when you have a condition of rolling economic crises. Unlike in pre-industrial bourgeois society, where it is up to the boss. Hence, the interests of labor and capital in like the conditions of like employment before the Industrial Revolution, before these constant rolling economic crises, and this is just one example. I'm just highlighting this, are in tandem. And that's why, for example, the French Revolution didn't see the need to give the vote to domestic servants, etc. And again, just as an example. Whereas there is a macro level, there is a need for labor to mediate capital. There's a mutual mediation that takes place, but there's a political contradiction that manifests where capital cannot guarantee individual laborers a job. That's the distinction.
Thank you.
Just to guarantee substantial audience Q&A time, we're going to request that you wrap it up the immediate 8-minute mark, and if you don't, we're going to begin knocking and not stop until you end your presentation. So our final question goes out to Ben Ogilvie, the thinker, and Desmund Hui of Platypus. It has become commonplace for the left to blame neoliberalism for the failures of contemporary American society, and much of the right has also become amenable to this perspective. While left opposition to neoliberal policy is neither new or unexpected, many have been surprised that the party of Ronald Reagan would come to harbor anti-neoliberal sympathies. This opposition to neoliberalism has been taken up by Donald Trump in his opposition to globalization, Bernie Sanders in his bid to secure a spot for socialism within the Democratic Party, and currently Biden works to uphold Trump's anti-globalization practices without affirming racist nationalism and seeks to support the labor movement without raising the question of socialism. We ask, is neoliberalism in crisis? And is American democracy adequate to address this crisis of capitalism?
Oh, am I starting?
You're starting.
Oh, wow. Well, thank you all for being here. We're happy to distract you from your finals for a little while. Also, thank you for sticking it out for like about an hour and 8 minutes so far. I know that we talk a lot, and so we really appreciate it. First, I want to address, the people who wrote the prompts for this debate, the two very attractive gentlemen sitting in the center of the room, seem to have this really odd fixation on liberal values and all of that stuff. And I just don't get it. I mean, I've always thought of liberal values as being basically a stalking horse for elite policy preferences. So the core of liberalism is letting people do what they want, right? And that's great for rich people. So let's take drugs. Liberal drug policies are great for rich people because A, we like to use drugs, B, we can afford rehab, and C, we can afford to insulate ourselves from the consequences of drugs by living in nice neighborhoods like Hyde Park and not sketchy neighborhoods like Englewood or whatever. And using the state to protect the interest of the public interest by, say, banning drugs and getting rid of people who sell drugs, that's something only really poor people need who don't have the resources to insulate themselves from drugs. And that's, you could basically apply that same line of thinking to a lot of liberal policies. And I mean, some people like to append the label classical in front of liberal and say liberal is bad, but classical liberal is okay. And I don't mean to bag on I think Perry and Declan have a little bit more of a libertarian viewpoint. So I love you, you're great. But I just don't get why that's all that desirable either, or liberal democracy. Why would you put a liberal in front of the perfectly good democracy? I mean, we have people like Donald Trump, who is literally the living embodiment of democracy. He is a man of the people in the purest sense. Or Viktor Orban. He has a lot of the good things of Donald Trump, but he's actually competent on some level, which is attractive in its own way. And so those people are, I guess liberal politicians occasionally get elected as well, and I mean, good for them, but democracy doesn't have to be liberal, and maybe it's better if it isn't, in my opinion. Okay, neoliberalism. Let's talk about this. So, neoliberalism is a set of bad policy ideas that originated in the 1970s and 1980s, or at least that's when they became big. Most popularly associated with Ronald Reagan, but actually started by his predecessor, Jimmy Carter. See, we Republicans are not responsible for all of the bad things that happen in the world, okay? It was a thoroughly bipartisan movement that reached its zenith during the alternating rules of oligarchs Bush and Clinton and Bush 2 and almost Clinton 2, but then we got Obama, which is pretty much the same thing, except he's black. That's nice, I guess. And then is neoliberalism in crisis? Well, I think we're kind of in like the Brezhnev area of neoliberalism. So like, if we look at the Soviet Union, the Brezhnev era is when like the parts started falling off of the bus and things were like, okay, this isn't working. We need to like fix the system somehow. And that's a pretty good description of like where America is today. So the American dream, at least as it exists in the mind of your average American, includes some basic things like A, like being able to have a house and earn a living, maybe. That's kind of nice. And B, maybe like being able to get married and have a family at some point. I mean, I'm sure that's on your life plan eventually. I mean, you guys are elite, so maybe you have some other like bourgeois values or whatever when it comes to marriage and family. But most people eventually want to get married and have a family, and that's like the most, like A, having a source of income, and B, having a family. I mean, what else could you ask for in life? That's like the basic like middle class dream right there. Well, normal people in America in 2024 have a harder time attaining that dream than ever. I mean, the middle class is smaller than ever. The marriage and family pipeline is breaking, partly because men are just not employable anymore, and people without degrees can't earn a good living, and the cost of basic middle-class goods like homes and degrees has risen faster than the incomes used to pay those goods. And all of this is really, really bad. And there's another sort of stalking horse threat, which is the U.S. currency, which is kind of breaking. So Ronald Reagan, that actor turned president, was the first guy to really like run the budget deficit off the edge. And if the U.S. were a normal country like Argentina, then our bonds would have collapsed in a gigantic burning dumpster fire, and then the federal government would have had to exercise some fiscal discipline. But the U.S. is not a normal country. The U.S. dollar is a reserve currency, and we can run fiscal deficits and trade deficits until the cows go home. And we're running like a ton of them right now. Like the trade deficit is out of control. Biden is just emptying the federal treasury on Ukraine and on our student loans. I mean, I'll take that. But like, and also on all this like green climate pork. I mean, like $1 trillion for solar panels, really? And that's like not going to be good. I mean, eventually, if they stop buying our bonds, then we're going to stop being able to buy our cheap Chinese trash, and that's going to be bad. Okay, democracy. So I really like Plato's framework of democracy, oligarchy, and monarchy. Democracy in America is actually kind of weak. I mean, voters can prevent the legislature from doing really stupid things like cutting Social Security. Sorry, guys, again. Or like passing the Green New Deal as the Green New Deal. That would have been really stupid. Voters prevented that, thank goodness. But voters, other than that, don't have much say other than which pair of boring lawn signs they want to select on election day. And that's hardly democracy. I mean, in the past, populist organizations like labor unions or like grassrootsy churches had some influence and were kind of like the democratic institutions in America. But then the neoliberals kind of squashed them. And so now it's like, okay, they get to be in charge. The U.S. is really an oligarchy of the credentialed and the campaign donors. The swamp runs the swamp, let me tell you. I've been there. I've worked on Capitol Hill. It is really run by lobbyists who are pulling strings. And then monarchy. I mean, monarchy is really weak in America, even weaker than democracy. Joe Biden is out to lunch. Even when Donald Trump was elected, he couldn't do anything. I mean, did he build the wall? No, he didn't build the wall. Did he bring back the jobs? No, he didn't bring back the jobs. Did he bring home the troops at least? No, he didn't bring home the troops. I mean, he didn't start another war. That's the one thing that U.S. presidents can still do is start wars. I mean, just like ask all of them until we get up to Trump. They started a different war. But like, other than that, like, monarchy is kind of dead, and the president doesn't really do much and can't even fire his own people for goodness sake. All right, so what does the future look like? Well, I mean, I think things are going to be rough for a while. I think we're going to be looking at either like a right-wing Andrew Jackson scenario or a right-wing FDR scenario. So like, okay, Andrew Jackson was elected. I kind of love the man. I mean, he was a populist, but he was also pathologically corrupt, and he ruined the U.S. banking system, which, I mean, the U.S. had like 150 years of bank panics after Jackson got rid of the National Bank, which, I mean, great, the National Bank was corrupt and all, but like, did you really have to do that? He didn't have he went like chainsaw zombie against the oligarchy, but he didn't have an alternative plan. And then our other situation is FDR. So things get really bad. Like I think we need a total currency panic to get an FDR, a right-wing FDR scenario in America. We could have somebody actually, like the elite gets itself together and a president helps the elite get it together. And we start to see a program of real regeneration to do things like build jobs and get the birth rate back up to replacement and stuff like that. Thank you for coming to my TED Talk.
I'm going to stand up because I'm more comfortable standing. I did this last year as well, if you recall. And unfortunately, my remarks are way too long for 8 minutes. So if I can't finish them, I'll just leave them for the response section, if that's okay. Okay. The political crisis of neoliberalism has naturally taken the form of a crisis of the legitimacy of neoliberal economics, the main representative of which is, of course, Milton Friedman. The left has for the last 40 years made a boogeyman of Milton Friedman and the ideas he represents. Friedman stands accused of introducing what Naomi Klein in her 2007 anti-Friedmanite book, The Shock Doctrine, calls neoliberalism, an economic regime of, quote, corporatocracy, where multinational corporations, big finance, and corrupt politicians tear apart the social fabric across the world in pursuit of their insatiable personal gain. Friedman and his ideology of free markets are interpreted as giving carte blanche to private exploitation of the public interest. The archetype of neoliberalism in the minds of the left is the fictional corporate raider Gordon Gekko, who declared greed is good. Who could support that? The blame for the state of affairs does not rest on Friedman's shoulders alone, but supposedly stretches back hundreds of years into the origins of bourgeois thought, including Adam Smith and the American Revolution. Was Jefferson's Monticello plantation, born of the transatlantic slave trade, the first multinational corporation? Or is it the case that, as Edward Said wrote, the Declaration of Independence contains, quote, naked, deterministic, socially bloodthirsty, and competitive aspects of individualism? Thus, the very foundations of the American Republic are implicated in neoliberalism. The left's constant attacks on neoliberalism appear to have borne fruit with the Biden presidency. During the 2020 presidential campaign, Joe Biden proclaimed, quote, Milton Friedman isn't running the show anymore. The millennial left's dream, exemplified in the two Bernie Sanders presidential campaigns of reintroducing the S word, socialism, into mainstream American politics against a neoliberal consensus, seems to have succeeded. Sanders himself has said Biden could be, quote, the most progressive president since FDR, while Bhaskar Sankara, the founding editor of Jacobin magazine turned president of the nation, has written, quote, socialists are now an entrenched part of mainstream American politics. No immediate setback or even the possible return of Donald Trump to the White House in 2024 will relegate us to our pre-2011 state. However, as the Biden administration stands racked with the lowest approval ratings on its economic performance in living memory, this victory does not taste as sweet as first imagined. Of course, the dirty little secret about the socialism the millennial left has peddled is that it has the same meaning for them as for Obama's Tea Party opponents, big government New Deal liberalism. Where neoliberalism embraces market individualism and denounces state collectivism, the millennial left embraces state collectivism and denounces market individualism. But in this case, it was completely unnecessary for Bernie Sanders to reintroduce the S word into mainstream politics to begin with, for the idea was always there, in the mouths of the right, from Ronald Reagan to Sarah Palin. The millennial left's attempt at socialism ultimately just amounts to drawing a plus sign where the Republicans draw a minus. This attempt is thus doomed to fail, for neoliberalism was born in a struggle with the socialism introduced by the prior New Deal order, and history has deemed neoliberalism the victor. Ironically, though Trump is mocked for his supposed desire to return to a retrograde 1950s with his slogan, Make America Great Again, it is really the millennial left that wants to return to such a pre-neoliberal era, possessing nostalgia for a time in which it was not even born. To truly understand neoliberalism and its relationship to socialism, we must first return to the roots of neoliberalism in its original critique. Fortunately, the University of Chicago provides an excellent opportunity to do just that. Professor Casey Mulligan, himself an ex-economic advisor to the Trump administration and who contributed to a 2018 government report entitled The Opportunity Cost of Socialism, currently teaches a class on the economics of socialism, which I had the pleasure to attend in the fall quarter of 2023. In his class, Professor Mulligan draws from the intellectual origins of neoliberalism in the Mont Pelerin Society, an organization of intellectuals that included such well-known individuals as Milton Friedman, Friedrich Hayek, and Ludwig von Mises, to rain calumny against socialism. He reminds us that capitalism preserves individual choice from the bureaucratic heel of the state, that innumerable collective action problems arise from any collectivistic organization not grounded in self-interest, free rider problems, metering problems, gluts and shortages due to price controls, etc., and that wherever the state has encroached on the market thus far, from the Soviet Union to Cuba to Venezuela, even to the squeaky clean welfare states of the Scandinavian countries, the result is underwhelming at best and a complete economic disaster at worst. All true. The only problem is that Professor Mulligan doesn't go far enough in his criticism of contemporary socialism. Professor Mulligan and his class identified contemporary millennial socialism with Marxism, and furthermore, a Marxism that extends all the way back to Marx. But the Mont Pelerin Society itself, whose first meeting was in 1947, was aware that the socialism they were confronted with in the mid-20th century was an entirely different beast to the Marxist-led socialist movement of the 19th century. As Friedrich Hayek wrote in the 1956 premise to his famous The Road to Serfdom, quote, "I recognize that the hot socialism against which the road to serfdom was mainly directed, that organized movement towards a deliberate organization of economic life by the state as the chief owner of the means of production, is nearly dead in the Western world. The century of socialism in this sense probably came to an end around 1948. That hodgepodge of ill-assembled and often inconsistent ideals which under the name of the welfare state has largely replaced socialism as the goal of the reformers." Or as Ludwig von Mises, a more astute reader of Marx, wrote in Omnipotent Government, quote, "Marxians do not support interventionism. They recognize the correctness of the teachings of economics concerning the frustration of interventionist measures. Insofar as some Marxist doctrinaires have recommended interventionism, they have done so because they considered it an instrument for paralyzing and destroying the capitalist economy, and hope thereby to accelerate the coming of socialism. But the consistent orthodox Marxists scorn interventionism as idle reformism, detrimental to the interests of the proletarians. They do not expect to bring about the socialist utopia by hampering the evolution of capitalism. On the contrary, they believe that only a full development of the productive forces of capitalism can result in socialism. Consistent Marxians abstain from doing anything to interfere with what they deem to be the natural evolution of capitalism." This is Ludwig von Mises. Furthermore, the Mont Pelerin Society's criticism of socialism in the 20th century take us no closer to understanding the relation between neoliberalism and socialism, for the society itself struggled to define the capitalism they sought to defend. While the society proclaimed in its founding statement that the troubling socialist tendencies in the West and around the world post-World War II were due to the, quote, "the growth of theories which question the desirability of the rule of law, further they have been fostered by a decline of belief in private property and the competitive market," they quickly discovered that to clarify what it meant to return to such classical liberal values as the rule of law, private property, and competitive markets was no easy task. And now infamous incident, Ludwig von Mises, the arch-economist of the Austrian School of Economics, midway through the first meeting of the society yelled, "You're all a bunch of socialists," before storming out of the room. This gets at the difficulty of defending the concept of so-called capitalism against socialism, for capitalism is itself a socialist term. It is already affected with its opposite. The term capitalism was coined by the French socialist Louis Blanc as a term of condemnation for the social system that emerged in the aftermath of the Industrial Revolution. In his 1850 edition of the Organization of Labor, Blanc defined capitalism as, quote, "the appropriation of capital by some to the exclusion of others." Capitalism, in its original socialist definition, then, did not refer to the rule of law, private property, or free markets, but the destruction of these institutions post-industrial revolution, the appearance that they were being monopolized by a capitalist class. It would make no sense, for instance, for Adam Smith to defend the rule of law, private property, or free markets as a system of capitalism. In other words, a system in the service of capital or capitalists. For Adam Smith, the form of free and cooperative society that had begun to emerge since the Renaissance and reach its most complete form at his time in America was a commercial society, what Hegel would later term bourgeois, a silver society. The purpose of this society was to serve not capital, but labor. As Smith wrote in The Wealth of Nations, quote, "Servants, laborers, and workmen of different kinds make up the far greater part of every great political society. But what improves the circumstances of the greater part can never be regarded as an inconvenience to the whole. No society can surely be flourishing and happy of which the far greater part of the members are poor and miserable." But this difference with Adam Smith comes as no surprise, as the Mont Pelerin Society possessed a more or less explicitly rejected the liberalism of Smith. It is not just socialism that underwent a fundamental transformation from the 19th to the 20th century, but liberalism too. It became vulgar. This is where it is vital that the Mont Pelerin Society were not liberals, but neoliberals. The prefix neo is of vital importance. Nor is this clearer than in the rejection or avoidance of the labor theory of value. Professor Mulligan in his class, as a rebuttal to status socialism, raised Friedman's idea of 4 ways of spending money, which demonstrates that only when you spend your own money on yourself are you incentivized to economize on and maximize the value of your purchases, hence the fundamental efficiency of private property and corresponding inefficiency of state taxation and spending. I'll finish this paragraph. Very good, but this only raises the question, what makes money yours? Is it because you hold it in your hand? But then any common thief or beggar, or even the state could claim another person's money was theirs. What turns mere possession into property is the claim to a legitimate right. But this only raises a deeper question, what is property? I mean, unfortunately, I don't have enough time, so I think I'll end here.
All right, I'm going to stand up because I think that's a great idea. I also have a nice suit on. So I'm going to take a moment to bag on Milton Friedman because that's something we both agree on. And then I want to talk a little bit about the conservative vision of the future and then ask you guys some probing questions about socialism, if you don't mind. And you can ask me probing questions too. All right, so Milton Friedman. I mean, who is this guy? So the United States between like 1930 and 1970, we, thanks to the New Deal, which was a bipartisan project as well, it just wasn't just Democrats, it wasn't just FDR, who actually I think was a good president, I like him a lot. We created maybe like the first middle class in this country that had a broad base. And so we really had a higher level of like relative, like not as bad income inequality and resolving poverty in this country for the first time, which was awesome. And then like Milton Friedman and Friedrich Hayek, who was another like moron as well, they started writing these books and they were like, hey, I mean, you know, having nice things means socialism, which is bad. And I mean, we should just, you know, if we should just let big corporations do whatever they want. That's a pretty good, like, in my opinion, a pretty good, like, high-level synopsis of Milton Friedmanite thought. It's not all that complicated. And then it was somehow, like, taken as gospel by the neoliberals and used as the basis for a whole bunch of bad policy decisions, like deregulating airlines and crushing organized labor and all that stuff. Anyway, all right, enough about Milton Friedman. Let's talk about the future, which is much more interesting. So we have, on the conservative angle, there's some reformist groups, especially like American Compass, Compact Magazine, those kinds of people who are trying to envision what a conservative future might look like. I think a huge big part of that is re-envisioning how trade works. So trade right now is sort of operates under neoliberal free trade dogma, which really doesn't do that well for workers. We've lost like 5 million good family-supporting manufacturing jobs to places like China since 2000, since China joined the WTO, which is bad. And we've also had our country's economic capacity and industrial base really gutted by these like stupid trade policies. So I think a fair trade settlement is hopefully in the works. And then also, I'd love to see, I think the right needs to get really serious about family formation and pronatalism. So in the US and in a lot of other countries, the birth rate is currently below replacement, and that's like a huge failure. It's an act of injustice towards all those people who aren't being born. It's really a crisis for all of us who eventually have to grow old and be taken care of by somebody else. I think there's a lot that right-wing people can do, and that also American politicians should do to increase the birth rate, to maybe like change the culture to be more supportive of families and all of that. All right, so that's my vision of the future. All right, socialism. So one big bone that I have with socialism is that socialism is supposed to be about what the proles want, right? Or about what helping the proles, maybe like reducing poverty for the proles. But it seems like the proles don't really want socialism. They seem to want like Trump, but competent. At least they keep voting for this Trump guy for some reason, even though there's a lot of good reasons not to vote for him, as has been alluded to earlier. So, like, my question is, why don't we just give the proles what they want, which seems like a better conservatism? I mean, most proles in America aren't really Marxists. Why do we want to go with that?
Okay, I also had a question for Ben.
Yeah.
Which was, you know, I listened to your talk and you sounded like Amy Goodman from like 1999 after like the Black Bloc rally.
I don't know what that is.
You sound like a 90s leftist, like
okay.
what you want from the government is what I'm trying to
All
say.
Right.
So I guess why the Republicans, you know, why are you going after the Republicans as the political agent? Why not the Michael Lind option? Why Soy Rob Amari?
Yeah, for sure. Soy Rob Amari, I love that one as well. He is a little bit of he's an interesting man for sure. Okay, so I guess like my personal political evolution mirrors that of a lot of America's proles, right? So like, hey, so like the proles can choose between the Republican Party and the Democratic Party, and I mean, for some reason they're choosing Republicans now. I think it's because the Democratic end of neoliberalism is worse than the Republican end. So let's talk about Tennessee and California, right? So a lot of people are moving out of California, especially working class and middle class people who are being squeezed by high rents, high taxes, high property values, and even like the good leftist things that California does, like they have a relatively better organized labor attitude in California, higher minimum wage. All of that I support, but still like Tennessee is kind of better for middle class people right now than California. And even like on an economic level, and then on a social level as well. I mean, I think there's a lot. Social liberalism is very much a bourgeois phenomenon, and it very much, I mean, drugs and family breakdown and all of that stuff are coming from the progressive left. And I'm really like a social conservative. I don't stand for that stuff. So like, hey, we have the icky libertarians in our coalition, and I mean, I deal with them, and I'm okay with that. I'd rather be with the icky libertarians than the icky progressives.
I mean,
that was a lot. I should have been shorter, but.
Should I? Yeah, I'll try to summarize the rest if that's okay.
If you want to just like engage with what Ben just said.
I think some reading out some stuff might engage with some things he said, if that's okay.
I can just raise a question for both sides if that.
Well, okay. Just try to not lose the thread here.
Yeah, of course. So I'll just read out a few more sections. Marxists usually idle. Wait, what?
No, for me, just engage.
Oh, I'm saying this will. Okay,
If you want to summarize, what you haven't gotten to read out from your speech, go ahead and summarize it. We would also like for you to address some of Ben's questions.
Oh, I was saying that some of the things in my speech was going to address. That was what I was implying. Okay, is it okay if I?
Sure.
Okay. Marx is usually either applauded or mocked for his alleged advocacy of a labor theory of value. But the real author of this theory was, of course, Adam Smith, who wrote, quote, "Labor was the first price, the original purchase money that was paid for all things." For Smith, labor was the source of value because it was the source of cooperation. Value was the expression of the powers of artisanal skill and the detailed division of labor harnessed to productive purposes. As Rousseau recognized in the social contract, one could only lay a legitimate claim to private property insofar as it served the general will of society. One has to justify their property to society, which in return transforms possession into right. To take any foundation other than cooperative labor as the basis of private property is to immediately summon the state, for any right that cannot be justified on the basis of a social cooperation can only be enforced through coercion. This is why the strength of civil social organizations of the working class, its attempts to assert the value of its labor through collective bargaining, is for Marx the index of the freedom of civil society as a whole. It is in this way that demand for free markets in the abstract, totally disconnected from the issue of the contradiction in the right of labor, is not the opposite of state intervention, but can actually become a demand for state intervention. It is not for nothing that Murray Rothbard, Austrian school follower of Ludwig von Mises, in his famous essay Milton Friedman Unraveled, accused Milton Friedman of all people of statism. Friedman's policy suggestions, his ideal of perfect competition, his monetarist empowerment of the Federal Reserve, and his famous universal basic income or negative income tax proposal, all meant to improve the efficiency of free markets, ultimately depend upon the state for enforcement and implementation. It is no wonder then that neoliberalism, and this will be the last paragraph, it is no wonder then that neoliberalism has turned out in practice, despite all ideological appearances, to be more a continuation than a change in the statism introduced by the New Deal. The immense power the Federal Reserve has over the entire world economy today, where millions can become unemployed by the turn of a dial, is truly the triumph of socialism. Not to mention the bureaucratic welfare state, which has very much survived into the present. Privatization has served not to liberate civil society, but merely outsource state functions to the private sector. Think of corporate enforcement of vaccine mandates, for example. Problems have accumulated instead of being resolved. Okay, so reading that out.
I wanted to can I relate the last paragraph to something that you said, Ben, which is that you said that neoliberalism is a set of bad policy ideas. From the 80s
I wanted to
and
bring this
90s.
up too.
This strikes me as analogous in some ways to what Perry said about the origins of the crisis of democracy, that people just, as a bolt from the blue, just forgot about history. You seem to be saying, as a bolt of the blue, idiots took over and they did bad policies. Is that really it? Is that why neoliberalism took place? Is it simply bad policies by bad people or dumb people?
Wait, sorry, before you respond, to respect everyone's time, at 7:36, we're going to move to audience Q&A, so
Okay.
just keep that in mind. And we'll really knock that.
I'll be really quick. Okay, so neoliberalism, those bad policies ideas have been around for a while before 1980. Some of them were around mainly like before 1930, and then the apocalypse of the Great Depression triggered the New Deal and improved things for a while, and then basically like that wore off, and then the goons took over again. So that's my high-level history. And then I guess like a question that I have for you, why do you guys want socialism instead of a better settlement between capital and labor? I mean, I think it's inevitable that every society is a hereditary aristocracy. Why don't we just try and make that system work instead of a better one? Or what you guys have in mind with socialism?
I've been talking a lot to you.
I mean, that would be like
There you should.
Anyway, that would be like a completely comfortable thing to do, but it seems to violate like the promises of the United States Constitution to do so. Like it violates the promises of the bourgeois revolution, freedom, as like concepts to just basically settle into being like, oh, we're just basically going to continue to do what we've already done. Where someone like Thomas Jefferson was like, maybe we need to like have a revolution like once every generation to like water the tree of liberty. And I don't think that's just like a bad idea by a bad actor. I think the meaning of that is actually history changes and society should have the freedom to change itself. Whereas if we just restrain it to basically just continue on and find new settlements forever, we're never actually going to exit the crisis. There's always going to be these stupid people who make stupid decisions, but maybe neoliberalism was the answer to a crisis that was posed from the previous settlement of the New Deal that itself went into crisis. And for a while it worked because Trump's not really like nostalgic for the 50s, he's like nostalgic for the 90s, like the height of neoliberalism, but now it doesn't. So there's now a post-neoliberal settlement that's happening through figures like Donald Trump and Joe Biden, who basically have to do the same things.
If I may offer just a kind of general question to, both sides really. So at least just on the Constitution, as far as I understand it, I think a lot of it emphasizes the principle of merit in the sense that you had a lot of these people, certainly, wealthy people, but by no means English aristocrats coming over, essentially founding this document. And do you think, at least just with this idea that we're making this binary of proletariat and capitalist, or whatever other term you want to use, to what degree is that sort of conflating, like, income categories or class categories with flesh and blood human beings?
It'd be conflating it on the basis of it's just, can you say that there's like a proletariat today or the capitalist classes today? Like, who is that? I have no clue. That would actually have to be constituted politically, but there's not really a socialist struggle that exists right now, like not a real one. So now it's basically just sociological categories of income brackets. So actually, yes, that would be completely muddling everything.
Thank you. We're going to cut it off there and we'll continue again. So, if anyone has a question, just raise your hand and we'll try to get through as many as
I love democracy.
Also, because we didn't begin the event until about 6:10, we're going to run with questions until 8:10.
Yeah, feel free to open forum.
So thank you all for coming out tonight. I think it was really interesting to hear your ideas. So my question is more directed towards the thinker, but to both sides. The two on your two names are
Declan and Perry.
So you guys talked a lot about basically that the masses don't seem to be responsible enough to govern themselves to a certain extent. And I'm thinking that the difference between an adult and a child is that children are not responsible for their actions, and therefore the adult makes decisions for children. This is more very simplified, but to a certain extent. My question is, if the masses aren't capable of governing themselves, then is it just to basically avail them of their poor governance? In other words, like almost from like a nihilist perspective or an anarchist perspective, do they deserve good governance if they are not able to bring it upon themselves? Shouldn't, from a certain perspective, if they make stupid decisions, shouldn't they suffer from their collective poor judgment?
So to answer that question, I'll think about this in two ways. The first is that the poor judgment of the masses affects people who are not in the masses. So no, I reject that entirely. There's clearly a class warfare going on in the United States. I agree with the Marxist analysis, but it's just they take a side on it that I don't take. So the masses governing has concrete impacts for everyone else. So I don't think we should just allow them to have carte blanche to do whatever they want. And second of all, I don't really think that your analogy of children and adults holds, because what democracy often does, unrestrained democracy, is circumscribe the realm of individual liberty, thereby making people more like children. A restrained government, which you achieve by putting checks on democracy, opens up a greater sphere for individual action because of wise, good governance creating the realm of individual liberty. So it actually produces the opposite effect, I think, of what you stated.
So I'll sort of add a little bit to that. I think one of the fundamental issues with a widely enfranchised electorate is just the idea that you have equal, not to be too super technical, but you have equal voting weight on every single individual person. But the problem is you have a lot of informational asymmetries. A lot of people are just simply casting votes, kind of throwing aside their ballot, saying, oh, I don't know, that person sounds like they have a cool name, so I'm just going to vote for them. But then you have other people who are more vested, say, in the issues, have more civics knowledge, etc., and their voting weight is essentially the same as random Joe on the street. Now, I think the system obviously is part to do with that, but at the same time, the solution, I don't know if Declan necessarily agrees, but I think has to just, maybe this is a more neoliberal take, but it's a sort of idea that we need to just expand at least the civics have like a civics requirement. I don't know. Civics education has to just be better. I think the public system as it stands now doesn't do a very good job at that. I think people are just kind of, I think that speaking volumes to that is just the idea that, for example, immigrants often test much better on civics tests than natural born Americans do.
I'm going to chime in as well, if you don't mind.
Still on the net response.
Oh, sorry. Okay, I'm going to be quick. Comparing North America and Latin America. In North America, democracy works because we have a broad enough income distribution here that really awful people don't get elected as easily. In Latin America, you have like really awful populist demagogue types, like anyone who's ever been in charge of Argentina or Bolivia or Peru. I mean, those people are just not the kind of people you want to have in charge of your country. And the reason why those really awful demagogues get elected is because we have the system, as usual, in Latin America screws over a lot of people and makes them very poor and oppressed. So I think democracy really requires a certain baseline level of income distribution to work effectively, in my opinion.
Can you repeat the question?
Sorry. Yeah, I basically said that if people aren't responsible enough or capable of governing themselves, do they deserve to be governed well? In other words, like maybe people should suffer for their own poor decisions.
They also raised the idea of a civics requirement and like a necessary amount of wealth redistribution. Is that like very?
Or allow us the civics and do more in the balance of income.
Well, civics is fine, but that's not really that much of a political question. It's just policy decision making, which I guess is fine. The education system's pretty bad. And yeah, I guess the state does basically render people into children by basically removing them from being agents. Or people don't really get the opportunity to actually take agency over their own lives. In many cases, they're basically just rendered into being permanent children. And I guess maybe there would be a sort of, if we just started making people take responsibility of it, I guess it could be just like a cruel awakening. So a new generation would be forced to basically be confronted with themselves. Meanwhile, we leave the current one basically in the dust, as they would basically receive the consequences of their actions they never know they'd receive the consequences for. But I feel like this is all just sort of like a what if thing. I would say the main question is just like, how do we get people to take responsibility for society? And I don't think basically just be by like slamming them with some policy decision or something like that. I think it has to be political organization at the end of the day. It has to be an independently organized political organization.
Could I add something very quickly? I thought it was ironic, like your proposals from the thinker, Perry and Declan. You just have like a lament about mass democracy, but of course any like rollback of mass democracy will have to take place on the basis of mass democracy, right? Like any policy proposal, you would need to get a democratic mandate for it because it's happened. And I think that was also the point of Ben's and Clay's remarks. Mass democracy is inevitable, and it's happened. And this kind of lamenting is just very romantic. Oh, if only we could return, but we would say it's impossible. From a Marxist perspective, it's impossible to return.
Attempts to return will inevitably make something new.
Yeah. And the socialist project is not just, the socialist project wasn't just to affirm democracy. We're well aware, many socialists were well aware mass democracy stultifies, weighs down the working class. That's why they need to be organized as a class, not just the people. The people, the masses, the people, no, but as a class, for their class interests to overcome the wage system, to use this classical language. Yeah, it wasn't just to affirm democracy, socialist politics historically, but they treated it as a problem that was inevitable and would have to be confronted, not just with laments, if only this didn't happen. Okay.
Yeah, so we have it. I guess we're directly addressed. Let's take
Also, let's make audience questions no more than 30 seconds, please.
Yeah, just say the question. So,
So Declan, you mentioned that there's a class war going on today, and I was a little bit confused because there's certainly social unrest, but I don't think that social unrest really constitutes a political movement aimed at changing society. And so, for both sides, what would a class war constitute? Like, what does that mean, class war? And what did it mean for?
It was probably a bit hyperbolic. What I mean by class war is that we have the masses using the instruments of government to take money from social betters and redistributing it against their consent and will to people on the lower end of the income distribution. That's all I mean by people using the forces of policy to achieve a redistribution of income. And by the way, if you're assessed taxes by the IRS, that's at a point of a gun. Because if you don't pay those taxes, somebody comes to your door and they say you're being arrested and you're taken away to jail. So it's a class war, in a certain sense, to take money from social betters, as I put it in quotation marks, and redistribute it.
It seems like it's more of a war of the state against society at large. The IRS isn't an organization against the wealthy, it's an organization against everyone. It exists to basically be able to make anyone liable for a crime.
Especially the poor, especially the working class.
Yeah, historically,
IRS locks up working class people far more than Al Capone or something like this.
the historical socialist parties oppose taxes, at least on the working class. So yeah, I would agree with how you characterize the IRS.
I have the exact opposite view. I'm actually a big fan of the IRS. I'm a big fan in general of wealth redistribution from the wealthy to the not as wealthy, as long as it's in a sensible way. Because, I mean, the wealthy are constantly redistributing the wealth of the rest of us to them. It's only natural that there should be some pushback, especially through like a democratic mechanism, like using government to take money from some people and spend it on stuff.
So I'm going to go a third dimension here, actually. And I think a lot of what the class warfare we're talking about with respect to, say, like the wealthy, the not wealthy, is almost a sort of proxy to some extent for a war on the young versus the old. And I think this implication carries further than just the idea that it's a bunch of working class people hating their capitalist owners. I think one example of this is just for Social Security, obviously. It's a pay-as-you-go system in this country, so it turns out the current government is essentially just borrowing money from the future and paying off the Social Security of people today. And this, goes and you just have to wait your turn. But it turns out, as Ben was saying, our fertility rate is, I believe, lower than, it's low. So that means Social Security inevitably is going to run into a big wall. So you're either going to have to raise the retirement age or do, a bunch of gimmicky tricks to try to fix that system. But it's not even just Social Security that's kind of in a crisis that I think exemplifies a young versus old kind of divide. I think there's also the idea, if you look at politics today, I mean, isn't one of the biggest complaints of the two candidates that they're really old? I mean, Joe Biden is over 80, Donald Trump's nearing 80. I think there are calls on both sides of the new left and the new right that are essentially saying, look, we need these young people out there. I'm not trying to endorse a certain view of whether they're good or not. I'm just saying that I think descriptively that's perfectly capturing the moment as at least heading into 2024. I mean, there are talks of, say, the DNC looking like 1968, where essentially you had a bunch of younger students. Well, I mean, you had the Vietnam War back then, essentially trying to, protest on these college campuses and, some deja vu kind of going on there now. But I think a lot of it now is just that also turns out old people are not retiring. So, at these, okay, it's like I want to go to law school. You have a lot of these people, all these top law firms making partner. Turns out they're not retiring. They're still in the game. And that means younger associates are stuck there at lower mid positions, waiting forever to make partner. They were always told when they were younger, you just got to wait your turn in line. But guess what? They're still waiting their turn in line. So I think to some extent that's sort of why I'm not sure too much about the kind of class warfare as typically understood, but I think it's just more exemplified in the kind of young versus old debate. And I think we're facing that increasingly today.
The original question.
Yeah, to return to the original question, I'll give you a non-answer, which is that perhaps there is no class struggle today because there is no socialist party organizing the workers' discontents. Now, we can still see, though, as has been pointed out, neoliberalism appears to be in crisis, and we know that capitalism is a bottom-up phenomenon. As I said in my presentation, the responsibility for the political regression of Bonapartism in the modern capitalist authoritarian state falls to the organized working class struggles provoking that destabilization. In the absence of a class struggle, there still are bourgeois discontents, which is still motivating changes in capitalist politics and is motivating the crisis of neoliberalism today.
I'll throw in a jab at the thinker to Perry and Declan's. Like Perry, you just saying this old and young. It might look like that, but of course every old politician was once young. For instance, the Clintons got their start in the McGovern campaign. They were McGovernites in 1972. So I feel like all your solutions just are like a romantic reaction for better days. Maybe the exception is Ben, who is more openly pro-capitalist, I would say, who is much less afraid of the deterioration that capitalism has brought, but of course that brings its own problems. Okay.
This one's for the thinker and pointer for Desmond. So one of the big points you guys made early on is the idea that similarity to the old forms of ancient government and democracy, is lawfare and attacking people in the minority. Just in a very specific sense, the DOJ under Biden was initially extremely hesitant to prosecute Trump, and this seems to be more than just show, as their hesitancy may well lead to Trump getting off the hook, not being tried until well after the 2024 election, largely due to a complex system of legal checks and protections. And I'd like to know how do you reconcile that with the image you paint?
Well, I mean, he's in a courtroom in New York City right now, isn't he?
Sure.
Yeah, so there you have it, being tried by, truly far-left prosecutors in New York City right now. He's facing a jury of his peers. So I really don't see how this holds any water, honestly.
Why specifically me?
Yeah, I talked about that more.
Okay, well, I could just respond. Well, of course, I don't think it's a good thing. I'm not entirely convinced that, that it's really the case. Biden is reluctant, or Biden administration is reluctant to prosecute Trump. I think it's telling that the Trump trials don't have any coverage on the left. Like free speech as an issue, which is revived on the left, doesn't extend to Trump. But besides that, maybe to raise a broader issue, of course, when Biden prosecutes Trump, or Biden the DOJ, he'll do it in the name of democracy, right? This will be pointed out. Very democratic. He is, I am the people. Didn't he say something like that? I am democracy when he was first elected. Yeah, he said that. I'm sure they really believe it. But this only brings up the problems of democracy and why it's the case that democracy and capitalism can be employed in this way, in a seemingly undemocratic manner, right? Champion of the people being prosecuted as an enemy of the people.
I'm going to chime in as well. This is the revenge of the oligarchy. The oligarchy is coming for the democracy. And the oligarchy likes to use the term liberal democracy. That's like its trademark phrase. If you could name it something, it would be liberal democracy, not the blob. That's too obvious. And here's another thing about the Trump prosecutions. They're not like carefully coordinated or intelligent. It's a bunch of like credentialed people who have main character syndrome who are just kind of like going for it. So I think this is kind of like the oligarchy, like the mask is coming off and it's starting to like malfunction a little bit. Brezhnev again is coming back.
That's not really true though, because Letitia James, the Attorney General of New York State, ran in 2018 on going after Trump. And that's why she made it past her primary and the general election. So what you see is a concerted effort within the democratic American apparatus to prosecute and persecute political enemies.
And the Biden administration appointed lawyers to work for the specific courts that are currently prosecuting Trump to basically, like, they just appointed, like, their own lawyers for them.
Yeah, white, yeah. It's in Hawaii, so.
Okay, so I have a question on your oligarchy campaigns, going off of the general threads that I think other people have concerning people have.
Yeah, can you speak up a little bit?
Oh, sorry. Building off of your oligarchy point, some of the previous concerns that have been raised. First, two questions. First, what are your positive arguments for going back to the sort of constitutional government that existed at the beginning of America? Because you gave arguments against democracy, like, and the majority as it currently exists, which might be solved with civic education, which Perry pointed out. But it doesn't seem clear that the oligarchy at the beginning of American democracy, or the democracy at the beginning of American democracy, was necessarily better for things like, for example, rape laws, or different laws on racial discrimination and slavery that existed then. It's not clear that the cream of the crop was running the government per se during those first 60 years. And then, second thing on the class war, it's unclear. Can you provide argumentation for how the class war exists, where the lower class and the middle class and the income brackets are pulling from the wealthy? Because it seems like the income spectrum skew very heavily the other way. I mean, Jeff Bezos, for example, has quite a bit of capital. It's unclear how we're pulling it necessarily from him. And like people who graduate from elite colleges go into consulting, and after a 4-year degree get paid, what, $100,000 a year? Probably more than that, which is a lot more than the average American. So it's unclear how the average American is necessarily pulling. Can you elaborate?
So thank you very much for the question. I'm not proposing that we restore oligarchy. I don't think we've ever had oligarchy as such, at least in the original founding design. So what we had in 1787 was an elaborate system of restraints on popular majorities. That system of restraints ensured that policies were actually salutary for the United States as a whole. As far as your racial discrimination point, it's popular majorities that instituted segregation, for example. Like the white Southerners were extremely racist and were, riled up by demagogues. So that is how you got segregation. It was a majoritarian movement. It was not an oligarchic, aristocratic one. And in fact, the wealthy Southerners in 1870 Virginia, for example, were opposed to segregation. And because that, would hinder their business interests. So it was a popular majority movement for segregation. And then as far as your class warfare point, could you repeat that question?
Oh, it just seems like it's not borne out by just looking at the income spectrum, where people who graduate from elite colleges such as this one, or people who have like big tech startups are making more money than the average American sees in a year, in 10 years. It doesn't feel like the average American's pulling from the wealthy. It feels like the other way around.
Well, you see it with the student debt issue. The attempt to take out student debt and then charge it to the taxpayer. That's an example of middle class expropriation from the wealthy.
I guess I can just sort of add a little bit on the original kind of point on the sort of race and slave policies. I think one thing that I think needs to be in consideration is just that, first of all, there's just a lot of disagreement over the slavery clause or slavery issue, especially among the founding fathers. I don't think there is any sort of unilateral agreement on that, and they think they deliberated for a very long time. And I think it was mainly just on pragmatic grounds. So, they immediately got rid of the slave trade. So essentially you kind of just fixed that population in place. But I think one thing that was heavily on their minds is just, at least before they became America, they had a long history of different slave rebellions. And yeah, I think just to kind of understand it from that context, these were bloody rebellions. These were slaves taking up arms, killing people. And, I'm not trying, obviously slavery is a horrendous moral wrong, but I think if you're thinking in the mindset of somebody in, say, the late 1700s, the population of the slave population, for example, in the southern colonies that time was more than that of the landowners and of the white class, or the white people. So ultimately, I think that has to be a serious, just sort of pragmatic concern because, like I said, you have things like the Stono Rebellion of, I believe, 1739 that had to be on their minds, where it's like, by the middle of the 19th century, the slave population is like 4 million, I believe. So, if you're talking about the mass scale rebellion, that's a serious concern, existential concern, just because of the fact that they haven't seen the benefit of racial integration. They haven't seen issues or events that occurred after them. And I think it's, much easier from our point of view now to say, okay, we have that benefit of hindsight, whereas they didn't have that. So I think they just did it on practical considerations, but I think they took that issue seriously, at least.
I think the best argument, best argument on this point is just that the aristocratic upper classes have always been more enlightened on these issues than the wide masses of whites in this time in America. Look up, if you have a chance, look up James K. Vardaman. He was the Democratic senator from Mississippi after the 17th Amendment, a repugnant, absolute vile racist who replaced an actual moderate on the racial question prior to the 17th Amendment. So what you see is masses just electing these vile racists and instituting racist policies. This is not a top-down thing. This is a bottom-up thing.
Do you guys have a response to it?
I'll just say, could I say something? Just very briefly on this problem of segregation, maybe. So how did socialists deal with segregation? They didn't ask to take back the votes from the poor white trash in the South. They didn't ask everyone to do a civics test. They organized the white and black working class together into a united working class movement. I can't really elaborate that anymore, but I think that maybe expresses a difference between us.
It's also just worth considering that I think they just believe that the question of slavery would dissolve in society itself. And I don't think it's a coincidence that the Civil War happened in 1863 when capitalism was posing itself as a crisis. And slavery actually was for a little bit dissolving on its own ends. And when capitalism became actually the industrial forces actually caused a greater crisis of labor in the North, slavery posed itself as an option by Southern politicians, basically be like, you guys have this labor crisis, we have this slavery thing, and this could resolve it for you guys. And actually the state had to step in order to abolish slavery at that point. But I think by the time it was like 1789, it could have actually been assumed like
all the
society will
founding
dissolve
fathers,
this.
all the major founding fathers were abolitionists. That was universally understood before the progressive era historiography. They were all abolitionists, period.
Yes.
They were.
This is a question for the thinker. I think this is important to clarify in your discussions of curtailing, to some extent, mass democracy. I see sort of two thresholds you guys are giving. One would be an economic distinction between where mass democracy means expanding to people who don't have property or capital. And the other one being both things like being lettered or being educated. I'm just curious as to which one it is. So if it's something regarding owning property, the question then becomes, why is owning property a sufficient stake to get a vote, and not having property not a sufficient stake? And then if it's something like being lettered, the general question of who decides if you're lettered, what does it mean to be lettered?
So when I opened this debate, I gave 3 concrete proposals, and neither of what you said fit into my argument. I proposed that we repeal the 17th Amendment and allow state legislatures to elect senators, so that would create a separate base of power to check the House. And then second, a balanced budget amendment to circumscribe envious majorities. And then third, let's bring back the smoke-filled room. Let's have party bosses pick who's nominated to be president and down the ballot. And that would give us, I think, better candidates than Joe Biden and Donald Trump.
Well, I think this is the part where I might agree with the sort of my colleagues on Platypus, where that I think to some degree, again, just because of the way enfranchisement works, you can't really roll it back. So mass democracy, I think, is just sort of here to stay. Though that sort of then guides, my more pragmatic view of the solution, as in you kind of have to work around the issue. So I agree with Declan in the sense that I think rolling back the 17th would be at least one start. Whether, implementation-wise, you can consider multiple things, but it would just be the idea that we need to sort of restore to some degree, or at least control for the excesses of, everyday lay people not knowing what they're voting for, yet being encouraged, in fact, to vote. Not just voting, they're encouraged to vote. I think in terms of the threshold, again, that's also just goes into the issue of mass democracy kind of being here to stay, where I just don't think it's feasible to, nor do I necessarily agree with sort of curbing enfranchisement. I think just sort of keeping it as is probably the least worst we can do in a sense. And I think, like I said, that's why I'm a proponent of something like civics education, where you're just trying to minimize the damage, perhaps, or the excesses of rampant mob democracy, of people thinking impulsively, casting votes on issues or candidates they have very little knowledge about. And I think, is that a perfect solution? By no means. But I think that's just probably the most damage minimizing one.
I think we answered this earlier in the audience Q&A.
Right. Does anyone have a question specifically for the Platypus, and anything you can also respond to? Yeah.
I guess this is somewhat for both, but I feel like I'm honestly just a little bit confused of where both sides are coming from, because on the one hand, both the thinker and the Platypus are talking about the dangers of mob democracy, of uneducated people who shouldn't be voting, in their words, versus both sides have also criticized the government, essentially, you guys could take the swamp or whatever, for persecuting Donald Trump or the tribes or whatever. So I'm a bit confused in how would reducing like populism or reducing democracy like get rid of corruption in the government? I feel like those two perspectives are contradictory.
Okay, I'll take that up. I think is a very good question. So you brought up we both seem to have similar positions, right? Like say takes on events of today. But of course, the crucial difference is our justification for them. I think the thinker I've been proposing the thinker really has a romantic reaction to mass democracy, just a flat rejection of it. Whereas we try to introduce the historical socialist perspective, which was never just a flat rejection, nor a flat affirmation, but rather taking up mass democracy as a problem, as an inevitable problem of capitalism. Mass democracy is inevitable, and the only way socialism can be achieved is by working through that mass democracy. On the state, you mentioned we both also are hostile to the state, right? We seem to contradict ourselves because we seem to, on the one hand, or state, specifically state suppression of Trump, because Trump is democracy, but then the state is suppressing Trump, but we're against democracy, but then we're, okay. To clarify that, is the state really the vehicle for social emancipation? Like, just put that flat on the table. And we would say this capitalist state that we live under from a socialist perspective is not. It's the special bodies of our men. There's all this socialist language that has gone before, that has been in socialist history.
We're defending him on the basis that it's just a violation of liberalism, like plain and simple. It's actually an expression of just like the general violation of liberalism in politics that can be seen at large in like a very heightened form. That basically the entire state apparatus can be used to persecute someone. Doing a lot of things, it's basically, like I said earlier, it's based on a lot of novel legal theories. And for a lot of things that are just generally done in politics, they had to basically find the courts. They had to like look through all of the courts and just find the ones to lock them up in the judicial system. On the other question though, I think a lot of these things, like we all have, well actually, let me rephrase that. Declan and Perry, I would say, have similar starting points as us, where I would also still call them like romantic reactionaries. I think they're all authentic conservatives. There is like a vitality to, I never remember, what's your name? Ben. Ben has like a certain kind of like conservative vitality that I do respect, although I will admit that we probably disagree with him the most, if we're just totally being honest about it. We all have similar start points. I think our solution is just that it has to be pushed through, like the crisis has to be worked through, and I think both Declan and Perry would like to kind of mitigate the effects of the crisis, if I'm not misrepresenting you.
Could I add just one more thing? On Ben, just a remark you made much earlier, we should just cut the liberal from democracy, because who needs liberalism? The working class needs liberalism. If it wants to organize itself, if it wants social freedom, the working class needs liberalism. Who needs democracy? Who needs the arm of the state? Democracy understood as just, state action. Of course, the ruling class. They love it. They love the state. They love this democracy to smash the working class over the head.
I'm going to...
I just want to clarify that you guys will take like this last response, and then just to respect everyone's time, we'll include it there. If you guys want to speak with people after, and I think we have the room for a while still, so feel free to use it. But yeah, just make this last response, and then we'll conclude.
I love being called out by name. I've got to respond to that. All right. Okay, let's talk about the state. So it seems like all the other people on this panel seem really concerned about like freedom and how we make people more free. And I mean, yeah, that's nice. I mean, I don't think that should be the overriding concern of everything that pervades our society. But okay, freedom, I like it. In America, I would argue that the biggest threats to freedom and to well-being as well are through private actors. So think like the media, NGO complex, the universities, the corporations, not so much the government. I mean, the government really doesn't do all that much repression in America. However, the government is one of the only organizations in American society that is democratically accountable to the people. So, I would love to see the state assert itself, even the president assert himself or herself over the rest of the state, and really, I think that's the way that we cure out of control oligarchy. So like one example is universities. I'm really not a big fan of a lot of the things that universities do. I'm in favor of like the government using basically fiscal blackmail to force the universities to get it together. They're not going to get it together on their own. Some people will call that a threat to freedom of academic whatever or speech but like no, I mean these places are paid for with taxpayer money in large quantities. The taxpayers should assert themselves and assert some domain over what happens here. So I think the state, and in particular, like monarchy, the president, yes.
To directly answer the question that you posed, we would have better elites if we did not have mass democracy. That's the basic answer to that question. And we would not have this swamp, meaning we would not have this giant complex of bureaucratic agencies if not for mass democracy demanding a resolution to various social problems at the federal level. That's why we have the swamp, and we would have better elites without that.
Thank you. All right. Thank you for everyone for participating in this debate. Let's just give everyone a round.